Hey, what's up everybody? Chris here. I'm the CEO of a startup company focused on ensuring there's a sustainable supply of human plasma and other components necessary to treat and cure the rare and chronic diseases that rely on plasma-derived therapies. I'm also the host of this podcast. Did you know there are more than 1 million plasma donors and more than 100,000 dedicated staff and professionals supporting this industry? But no one is having real conversations focused on the issues that exist within the current system. We sit down with people from all walks of life to have real conversations about all things plasma so that we can all learn the human side of this incredible business.
Okay, so shout out to our followers. I know it's been a while since our last episode, but we have a great one in store for you today. On today's episode, we unpack the ethical considerations of donating plasma for money, and we have a very special guest, Peter Jaworski, who is one of the most well-versed people in the industry that I have found to date. So Peter, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Chris. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I listened to it, by the way. So it's on my rotation. So I feel like I've met some of the people that work with you already through the podcast.
Yeah, all right, great. Okay, so a little bit about Peter. He's a professor of business ethics at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. He has been published in the Journal of Business Ethics, the Journal of Value Inquiry, the Canadian Journal of Law and Jurisprudence, Ethical Theory and Moral Practice, among many others. He's also written for or been cited in popular media outlets like The Economist, NPR, Bloomberg, Globe and Mail, National Post, Reader's Digest, Psychology Today, USA Today, Maclean's Magazine, Canadian Business, and many others. Peter, you have an interesting background. You're Polish by way of Canada. Now you live in the United States. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've immigrated a number of different times. Yeah, I was born in Poland, back when Poland was a communist country. Things were tough in Poland for most people back then, as you might know, and some of your listeners may or may not be aware. It was very difficult for most people. We were wealthy by Polish standards. My father is a dentist. My grandmother on my father's side was also a dentist. My grandfather on my father's side was an engineer. So we came from, these were, by the way, the reason why it's relevant that my dad was a dentist and that his mother was a dentist is that dentistry as well as engineering were considered privileged professions in Poland at the time. And that meant that you could draw a private income on top of the income that you received from the government, right? So my father's clientele were mostly West Germans. So people from West Germany would travel to Poland because dentistry was more affordable in Poland for people from West Germany. And so we were wealthy by Polish standards. That's relevant for a bit of the story a little bit later on. Neither my mother nor my father were keen on the Polish government. They didn't like it, but they weren't particularly politically active, except they would always say yes when their friends would ask them to do something political. So when I was a baby, my mother was approached by her friends and they said, hey, listen, will you hand out these like anti-government leaflets to total strangers on the streets of Wrocław? I'm from Wrocław, Poland, the city there. And what did my mother say? Did she say, no, that's crazy, I have two small kids, I could get in a lot of trouble? No, she said, yeah, of course. And so when I was in a carriage, my mother used to walk around downtown Wrocław and hand out, it's called Solidarność, which was the solidarity, the union movement against the communist government. And she would hand out these leaflets to total strangers and be like, do you hate the government? Yeah, me too. Here you go. Read all about it, right? I mean, those weren't the words that she would use, but nevertheless, the risk was there. My dad was approached by his friends and they said, hey, listen, can we hide a radio receiver, an illegal underground radio receiver somewhere in your house? And at the time, there was a radio station called Radio Free Poland. You might have heard of like Radio Free Cuba, or there was a series of these radio stations, Radio Free Slovakia or Czechoslovakia at the time, Radio Free Romania, and so on. And my dad said, yeah, sure. And I'll show you where you could hide this like radio receiver. Anyways, it's an underground illegal radio station. They would hide these different receivers or transponders or whatever they're called in private homes. And then that way, if the government found one of them and took it down, the broadcast would continue. And my dad was like, yeah, and I'll show you where to hide it. And they said, no, this is not how this works. The way this works is you make a copy of a key to your home and you give us a copy of the key to your home. And then when you're away, we may or may not like go in your home and hide this illegal receiver. To this day, I have no
Wow.
idea whether or not anybody actually did hide one of these radio things in our home. But I do know that my dad did make a copy of the key to our home and give it to his friends. Fast forward a little bit to 1984. In 1984, we requested permission to travel outside of the communist bloc of countries. All the passports were held at the local police station, and you had to request your passport to be able to travel. If you wanted to, we did a lot of traveling. If you wanted to travel within the communist bloc, it was not a problem. It was just a formality. You show up, they give you all the passports, and you go to like Bulgaria. We went to Bulgaria a lot. Nice beaches in Bulgaria. But we wanted to go to West Germany. And typically, if you wanted to go outside of the communist bloc of countries, they would pull this trick where they would give you your passport and they'd let your son travel with you, but then they would be like, your wife and your daughter, unfortunately, they'll have to stay behind. But in our case, and I think it was because we were so wealthy, they gave us all 4 of our passports. So we went to West Germany on vacation. It was supposed to be just a vacation. My parents never intended to like escape Poland or anything like that. But my dad got a phone call from his mother, and she said, "Hey, listen, Lek," that's my dad's name, Lek. There's a letter here for you from the local police station. They'd like to have a meeting with you. And at the time, you would get this letter. You go to the police station. They say, here's your parking ticket or something like that. It could be anything. But there we were in West Germany, and my mother was like, well, what if this is about those stupid leaflets that I was handing out in downtown Wrocław? And my dad was like, what if they did put like a radio receiver while we're here on vacation in West Germany? And what if they found it? What if it's about that? So on that day, my parents decided that we would never go back to Poland again, right?
Wow.
And so we filed for political refugee status in West Germany. And we immediately filed paperwork in order to be able to immigrate to a free country. And that free country is, of course,
Canada.
You guessed it, Canada. When I tell this story, I often pause and people, since I teach in the US, I pause and people go, America. And I go, you guessed it, Canada. Anyways, it took Canada 3 years to accept our request to immigrate. But 3 years later, we got a chance to immigrate into Canada. That was 1987. I became a Canadian citizen in 1992, the same year the Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series. That's when I felt the most Canadian in my life. And then since then, I moved to the United States. I did my PhD in the United States. And then my first job after my doctorate was at Georgetown University. And so I've been in the US ever since. I married the love of my life, who happens to be from Iowa. And now I'm a permanent resident here in the United States of America. So that's my story.
All right. Well, that's exciting, and we could probably do an entire podcast just on that, because I am interested. Like, so you just one day, all of a sudden, you were now residents of West Germany, and you had to live there for 3 years before you could immigrate to Canada. So
yeah, it's true. Okay. And it was kind of tough, actually, because we lived in it was not a camp, but it was like housing apartment blocks that housed mostly Polish refugees and Turkish refugees.
Okay.
And I went to school down the hill with German students, and it was tough for my parents, although your listeners can't tell, but I'm like blonde hair, blue-eyed. I look like a German, so things were comfortable for me, but they were uncomfortable for my parents. There was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in Germany at the time. I didn't feel it, but my parents did.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, so you have another very fascinating trajectory throughout your life in that you have this focus of ethics and economics on the global plasma industry. So how did you arrive at that focus in your career?
Right. Well, it actually runs through hematopoietic stem cells or bone marrow. Back in 2015, I had an MBA student who started a company called Hemios, and they planned on compensating bone marrow donors, right? In the US, it's legal to compensate bone marrow donors provided that you acquire peripheral blood stem cells through the process of bone marrow apheresis. rather than from that giant needle that people get
Yeah.
stuck in their hip. It's called aspiration. So Doug, that was his name, Doug started a company, and his mission was to improve the odds for people who needed a bone marrow transplant by paying people to donate peripheral blood stem cells. Well, the Department of Health and Human Services, a subdivision of them, it doesn't, HRSA, it doesn't matter, all these acronyms or whatever. They have rulemaking authority, and so they have the power to just change the rules. And so they proposed a new rule that would make it illegal to compensate donors for peripheral blood stem cells. He came running to me and he was like, "Professor, help, all of their arguments are ethical. They're all like, you can't pay people, this is exploitation, what about altruism, this is commodification, and so on." These are all the arguments that they're presenting as reasons to introduce this new rule. So I put a letter together from prominent ethicists and economists, including, some of your listeners might know Peter Singer, who's like a very famous philosopher. We had a couple of Nobel Prize winners sign on to the letter, including Alvin Roth, who's an economist that some of your listeners might be familiar with. And I posted the letter, sent it to the Department of Health and Human Services. I then presented the letter to them. I also presented the letter at a Senate briefing. No senator showed up, by the way, just their staff. This is
Seems typical.
And to my surprise, the letter had played some role in the department sort of dawdling until the timeline that Congress gave them expired. But in the process of trying to figure out, what is bone marrow apheresis, what are all of these things, I realized that the most frequently used kind of apheresis or apheresis is plasmapheresis. And being Canadian, I discovered that there was this controversy in Canada over whether or not to permit compensation for donors of plasma. Now, as you know, as a lot of people within the plasma industry know, I'm a big proponent of the use of compensation for donation because it's effective, because it works, because it saves more lives, right? Because also it's cheaper, right? It's more efficient. And so coming across this debate in Canada, I decided to become involved. That was back in 2016. And since then, my daily focus, Chris, has been plasma. I search it out on Twitter and elsewhere. I look up articles. I'm really interested in this. And I think I bring a different perspective on this issue than, it turns out, I speak with professional ethicists, and it turns out that when I go to different universities and I talk about blood plasma, overwhelmingly, the majority of ethicists, once they know the facts, are on board with what I'm arguing. But a subset of ethicists, namely bioethicists and people who work in hospitals and places like that, there's still a lot of, how to put it, opposition, I guess. And it also depends on where it is too, because in Europe, there's a lot more opposition than in the United States or Canada.
Yeah, and that's how you and I got connected originally. It was a few years back, and I was involved with another company where we were taking the same concept of compensated plasma donors to the transfusion space, which it's not really done, and there's some FDA guidance in place as to how you can compensate donors there and still keep the volunteer label on the unit of blood. So different things, transfusion medicine and plasma donation are two different industries. One's more of a direct vein to vein. The other one is more of a pharmacological route where it goes and it's manufactured into various therapies. So anyway, that's how Peter and I got connected. So just a little bit for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the plasma space, just offer a little background here. So human plasma is the liquid portion of your blood, and is comprised of a wide range of proteins that play a key role in human physiology, particularly in immune function, clotting, and hemostasis. Plasma proteins are vital in the production of medicines for rare and chronic diseases, as well as emergency and surgical medicine. These include various immune deficiencies, multifocal motor neuropathies, clotting conditions such as hemophilia, et cetera. And how the industry works is that human plasma from blood and plasma donors is collected and then subsequently manufactured into various therapeutic applications and distributed around the world. It's important to note that something like 70% of the world's plasma comes from the United States. And the reason for this is that the US, population aside, there's a regulatory framework that allows for source plasma, a donor, to donate up to 104 times a year. And there's also no real sort of regulatory restriction on donor compensation. So, Peter, with that background and then with your background as well, maybe you could just give a quick overview of the current state of plasma donation in the United States in your view.
Yeah, by the way, 70% of the world's plasma comes from the United States. You mentioned that, and I think it's worth highlighting. 70%, that's an enormous amount.
Yeah.
If you add the other countries, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Czech Republic together, they also allow a form of compensation. It's a fixed rate kind of compensation, so it's less than what donors are paid in the United States, and it's uniform. So they're not allowed to sort of adjust it up or down and so on. But if you add those countries, you get all the way up to 89%. So 89% of the plasma used to manufacture the therapies that you just mentioned, right? And actually, we're basically talking about immunoglobulin or antibodies, right?
Right.
89% of that plasma comes from countries that allow some form of donor compensation. That's pretty remarkable. What is the state of the American plasma collection system? Well, let me tell you, it's growing, and it's growing so fast. The demand for immunoglobulin is its growth rate is unrelenting. It's like 6 to 8% every single year, and it's been like that over the past, let's say, 15 to 20 years, maybe more than that. And projections going forward into the future is that that demand will continue to climb at rates of 6 to 8% per year. We are getting better at screening babies for the diseases that immunoglobulin is effective against. And also some of the lower income countries are slowly coming online. So South America uses, I think it's 2 to 5% of all of the immunoglobulin used around the world. Compared with like North America, Canada and the United States use 49% of all of the immunoglobulin used around the world, right? It's not as though Canadians and Americans suffer from these diseases at different rates than people in South America. It's just that in South America, if you have an immune deficiency, nobody catches it, and then your life expectancy is extremely brief. Right? So as these countries improve their screening techniques and so on, we should see even higher demand from lower income countries and medium income countries. The United States has seen a remarkable growth in the number of plasma collection centers. I think partly that's motivated by these regulations and by the recognition that the demand for this therapy will continue to climb going forward into the future. And also there's hundreds of proteins in our plasma that we don't even know how to make medical use of. At some point, we're going to discover that one of the proteins that we don't really know about has this particular use, and then we'll be able to convert that into a plasma protein therapy as well. The United States is the driver. I mean, 70%, it's going to be more than that very soon if it isn't already. There are now over 1,000 plasma collection centers in the United States, and there's room for plenty more, right? There's room for plenty more. As you know, the European Union is going through their substance of human origin regulations. They're going to make it uniform across the European Union. There's some chance that they're going to change the rules regarding compensation, making it more difficult for Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to continue their practice, and for other countries to change over to the model that actually works, which is the model of donor compensation. And if they make that mistake, then basically the world will become almost entirely reliant on the United States, even though it is already nearly 3/4 dependent on the United States. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, in terms of the demand, you're right. Like all of the projections see this just continuing in just the current indications, right? Continuing at that 6 to 8%, for the foreseeable future. And then you mentioned the indications that are yet to be discovered. And there's a lot of talk about cell and gene therapies and their impact on this space, but when talking with the experts, like these are so specific that you can't just, create a cell and gene therapy and it's going to wipe out primary immune deficiency. It's so specific. There's something like 405 variants of that you would have to create. And it's just not, it's not going to happen in the short term or even the medium term.
Can I tell you a story about that for just a second, Chris? Because
Yeah.
I think it's part of the reason why I became as passionate about this issue as I did is because, you know, you meet patients. I give talks at different patient organization events, and then these people become your friends, and then it becomes like a very real issue with very real human impact. So behind me over here, I have two dolls. Your listeners can't see the dolls, but one of them is like a little kid, and the other one is like this little imaginary monster or something like that. This is Jakub Guzak, or Jacob, and that's Buvo is his imaginary friend. Now, I met Jacob's mother, Paula Andrea. I met her at the what are they? Oh, they just changed their name. So it was the Canadian Immunodeficiency Patient Organization, or CIPO, and they just changed to Immunity. That's the name. So I met them. I met the mother of Jacob recently at a recent conference. Jacob has SCID, which is severe combined immune deficiency, which is a genetic problem that means, I mean, it used to be called the bubble boy disease, right? So Jacob, who's just a little kid, you know, spends most of his time indoors because his body just fails to make the right antibodies, and his life is threatened through something as minor as like a regular cold. You and I get a cold and it's fine. Jacob gets a cold and it's a massive problem because he can't fight off that infection, right? Jacob is one of 24 people selected for a gene therapy treatment at UCLA in the United States. His mother wrote this book that's behind me. It's called In My Magical Bubble, about Jacob's life and about his imaginary friend Buvo. And that's all in an effort to raise the $3 million, I think it's $3 million that it costs for Jacob's gene therapy. So the gene therapy stuff is brand new. There's a good chance that he'll be able to go. And if he is able to go, then there's a good chance that the gene therapy is going to be effective. And that will mean that it'll fix his severe combined immune deficiency. But in the meantime, Jacob is reliant on immunoglobulin therapy. So he's reliant on mine and yours and your listeners' antibodies in order to be able to like live a normal life. You're right, gene therapy is coming. Gene therapy is very expensive. But it's not going to be effective for everyone. And we have other uses for immunoglobulin as well. Severe combined immune deficiency is very rare.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so I want to transition into the ethical implications of plasma donation. So maybe you could help unpack some of these ethical dimensions, including equity, justice, and the idea of selling a part of the human body for profit.
Yeah, okay, so let's sort of begin at the very beginning, which is this: like, why do we collect plasma in the first place? Why do we collect blood? Why do we collect substances of human origin at all? Look, the moral point of having a system of plasma collection is to collect enough blood, plasma, peripheral blood stem cells, and so on, in order to meet the needs of patients. That's the primary moral point of having a system in the first place. Look, if we found alternatives for plasma, if we found some kind of therapy that worked just as well as immunoglobulin, and we didn't need human blood plasma for it anymore, we would stop collecting blood plasma. We would not continue collecting blood plasma for the sake of giving you or me an opportunity to express our altruism, or in order to stitch us together through community solidarity or something like this. I hear this kind of objection to donor compensation in Europe, and I'm like, where are your priorities, your moral priorities? It's not about donor altruism, and it's not about community solidarity. It's about saving and improving the lives of patients. That's a primary moral goal. And if you are not hitting that goal, you need to change your system. I don't care if that means it comes at the expense of an opportunity to express altruism, right? That's at best of secondary moral interest. Of course, in the United States, I think for the most part, people understand that. The same is true in Canada. But you'll notice the discussion in Europe, in the European Union. Italy and Spain call blood and plasma donations, they call them solidarity donations. as though the thing that matters in giving blood or plasma is community solidarity and not the patients that benefit from this treatment. So in terms of justice, we need to get our priorities straight. And the primary priority is, look, this is about patients. Now, separately, in the effort to like attempt to collect enough blood, plasma, peripheral blood stem cells, you know, whatever else you're collecting, there are certain moral restrictions on what you can do to encourage those donations. Most importantly, you don't want to create new patients.
Right.
So you don't want to do something, you want to help patients and make them non-patients. You don't want to create patients in the process of treating or curing your patients. So we can't take so much blood that somebody will have to go to the hospital because they have some kind of problem, you know, medical problem. So we do have to take donor health very seriously. You might also take seriously concerns like donor exploitation or wrongful exploitation of the people that give blood, plasma, whatever. And we can talk about that too. There's also a worry about commodification. So what we don't want is for people to think of their bodies as like mere instruments. Or rather, we don't want to think about persons as mere instruments. And concerns have been raised that like the companies that use donor compensation to try to incentivize people to donate plasma, they treat these people as mere instruments. They're just looking for the plasma and nothing else. I have responses to each of these. Do you want to hear my responses to each of these?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Right. When it comes to the commodification objection, I just find that one to be a little bit weird. And I think there are certain kinds of solutions to that problem that I think people don't take seriously enough. First of all, we pay lots of people. We pay doctors, we pay nurses, we pay all of these people. We just don't pay, or in the US we do, but in some parts of Canada, in let's say France, they just don't pay the person whose plasma it is. And you might wonder, well, why is it commodificatory to pay the donor, but it isn't commodificatory in this like worrisome way for the hospital who has the plasma to then, or the organization that collects the plasma to then sell that plasma to the hospitals, right? Why isn't that a problem? It seems a little bit selective that we're so focused on whether or not the donor gets paid. I mean, the phlebotomist gets paid for doing what they do. The doctor at the plasma collection center or the one who uses the plasma, the therapy and helps treat patients, they get paid for what they do. It's just a donor. And suddenly all of this attention is drawn on the, oh no, what if they participate in the money making that happens when it comes to blood and plasma? I just find that super puzzling. Another solution, some people call this a euphemism, but I don't think we should think of it that way, is to consider the payment as payment for time and effort and for the inconvenience rather than for the plasma itself. This is how people discuss it in the European Union. Now, I understand that the response is going to be, oh, that's just a euphemism. Of course, everybody just pays for plasma. Okay, but hold on a second. Think about adoptions. People have to pay money in order to be able to adopt a baby. But we don't think that people are paying for the baby. We think that they're paying for the services, the time, effort, and the inconvenience of like all the
administration of it. Yeah.
The administration of it. So maybe you think it's euphemistic, but actually, is it? Not really. And I think that would help solve the commodification problem. And oh, by the way, the legal system in the United States treats payment for plasma donation as payment for time and effort. Right. So there have been a series of legal cases, some of them negligence cases or like liability cases, and in tax cases, right? People were like, oh yeah, I sold my property. So what matters is a capital gains tax rather than like a tax on my income, on ordinary income. And the courts were like, no, it's not property. So you don't calculate, capital gains tax would be less than like an income tax. The court ruled, no, it's ordinary income. It's like you're being paid for time and effort. In the negligence cases, a hospital gave Martha Perlmutter, this is back in 1954, a tainted blood transfusion. Martha Perlmutter sued on the assumption that like, okay, well, the blood was a product and products liability law applies, so the hospital is liable, right? They sold me a defective product. On the bill, I got a bill. It said $60 for blood. So the blood was a product that they sold me. The product was defective. Products liability law applies. You're liable. But the court was like, no, you're not liable because the blood is not a product. What you paid for was a service, and the blood was incidental to the service, right? So they were not liable on those grounds. So here you have a series of legal court cases that suggest that what is being sold when you exchange plasma for money is not the plasma itself, but the time and effort, right? And now if we're worried about the commodification of time and effort, well, we pay for time and effort all the time, so there's no commodificatory concerns, or they're less plausible. And then as for exploitation, I mean, you and I both know, I think the people who raise the exploitation concerns just basically have never donated plasma. They don't know what it involves. It's no big deal. The risks associated with plasma donations are so small, right? Yes, they're very real, and I don't want to downplay them, but like they're so small. I've done it, right? Lots of people donate plasma all the time. It's not a big deal. You spend about an hour and a half at the plasma center, and in exchange, you get now $65. That's a good deal. And the average price, the global price of a liter of plasma is what, $230 per liter, and between $200 and $230 per liter. The donor gets $65. That's what? That's like 40%. I mean, more than $65 because you donate about 800 milliliters. So it's going to work out to about $80 per liter. That's nearly half. That's a really good deal. So I just think it's nuts that people think it's exploitative, right? Yeah,
I agree, and we've seen it time and time again. You bring a patient into the center and they start to interact with donors, and this interaction between patient and donor it's meaningful, right? And so I'm not trying to say this because you should do it out of the kindness of your heart. Of course, like we're all good humans, right? But when you get a patient and a donor together, it becomes meaningful. The patient certainly doesn't see this as being exploitive because we're bringing them in and we're saying, hey, like we're being transparent about the process. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit as it pertains to that concept.
Sorry to interject and give you like one final thing about exploitation. Which is like, okay, the problem of exploitation here, the issue is that some people don't have enough income. That's the issue. We don't solve that problem by banning donor compensation.
That's true.
Right? Like you're not addressing the problem. Right? The problem isn't that like people who are poor get paid to donate plasma. The problem is that there are people who are poor. Right? And you don't fix the problem by banning it. It's not as though poor people in France are better off because they can't make money by donating plasma. Like it just doesn't help that person at all. You're forced then to pick something that from your own perspective is worse to do in order to make ends meet. So I don't get this objection to donor compensation at all.
To that point, there's this other industry that is payday loans, right? And so is that exploitive? And think about where these are located. So it's a different, I would say it's a different side of the coin, but you don't hear the same argument. So about you can't do this, right? So,
and the reason you bring that up, by the way, is because there was a paper released that showed that that what happens is that people substitute the money from payday loans for the money that they receive for plasma donation. So everywhere where there's an opportunity to donate plasma and receive compensation, you have lower rates of use of payday loans. And if you're concerned about exploitation, it looks like the high interest rates from payday loans are more likely to be exploitative than donor compensation.
And we talk about this. You talked about the safety profile a minute ago of like this is a safe process, and again, not to downplay the risk associated with it, but this is a safe process. There are 60 million plus plasma donations in the United States every year, and so it's certainly something that I strongly feel we should allow donors to participate in the upside here. We allow them to do Uber, we allow them to do DoorDash, things like that. It's not the same thing, but it's a similar concept in that it's sort of a gig economy type of process. So
yeah, if you think there's an unfair division of the benefits from trade, like if you think donors are paid too little or something like that, right? How much worse is it to pay people exactly $0?
right. Right.
Right. Like in Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada, they ban compensation for plasma donations. So they pay people $0. So, and it's not as though money isn't made from the
Right.
plasma.
Right.
Right. So if you're concerned about that, it's even worse if you pay people nothing. Like, how is that an improvement?
Yeah. And yeah, we often think about the not-for-profit blood industry, and don't get me wrong, they do a lot of good, but just because something is tagged with not-for-profit does not mean that they don't make a lot of money doing it. So
that's exactly right. I mean, people do. And I do want to emphasize, like, I don't have a problem with people making money, right? Like, that's okay. I think it's perfectly appropriate for like the administrators at Canadian Blood Services to be paid six-figure salaries.
Sure.
Right. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the people in the Établissement Français du Sang, the French like blood donation. I think it's perfectly fine for all those people to be paid. But unlike them, I think it's also perfectly fine to compensate donors, to encourage them to like donate, and to make it, you know, a lot of people don't donate blood because they don't have the time. A lot of people don't donate blood because, you know, they have to go to work. They have to do things. There's expenses. And if you pay people, you know, at least in the case of plasma, I definitely don't want to mix up blood and plasma. This is an important difference. But people do cite this stuff. And we know survey answers are about whole blood donation. We don't do enough studies of plasma donors and plasma donation, but I'm assuming that similar considerations will apply on both sides.
Yeah. And to put a pin in this point, like you've said this all along, in the end, it's about ensuring there's enough supply for the patients while doing no harm, right? So and compensation, and from that perspective, is the way to do it.
Yeah, and like France is failing their patients, right? Italy is failing their patient communities. So are parts of Canada. Right? Most countries in the world are failing their patient populations because we know we have a way of collecting enough plasma to meet the needs of patients. We refuse to use it, or many countries refuse to use it. And I think that's a moral problem. And I think people should raise that moral problem more often with those countries. And then, of course, as you know, like it's not as though the patients go without the therapies. In France, for example, right?
Right.
No.
Right.
What they do is they import the therapies that are made with the plasma of compensated American donors.
Right. So it's almost
Australia, Red Cross Lifeblood.
Yeah.
It's a bit of hypocrisy, right? Like Red Cross Lifeblood collects enough plasma to meet the needs of something like 56% of the needs of Australian patients. Where do you think the rest comes from? Right. It all comes from America, where donors are paid. So Australians are paying donors, right? They just happen to prefer paying Americans rather than their own citizens. Right. Ontario pays donors. Canada is over 80% dependent on plasma donated in the United States. Ontario pays donors. They just refuse to pay Ontarians and instead are like, yeah, we'd prefer to pay Americans. If you think this is like commodification or exploitation or you know, a morally difficult issue, why is it better to exploit or commodify Americans than to exploit or commodify Ontarians? This is not how morality works, right? You don't go, morality is about what's inside our borders. No, morality is about persons, human beings, right? And it's universal.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I want to move on here and I want to draw the international comparison. Right. So we've talked about it at a high level already. United States, there's very little, if any, regulation related to the compensation of donors. There's 6 other countries or 5 other countries that allow compensation for donors. That's Germany, Czech Republic, Hungary, Austria. Who am I missing?
Well, okay, so there's a few new ones. Ukraine allows it.
Ukraine. Oh,
But
good.
you know, there's a war in Ukraine. Egypt created a
Mm-hmm.
partnership with Grifols, so
Mm-hmm.
they've started to compensate donors. Iran
Mm-hmm.
compensates plasma donors or allows it. Let's see here. I think there's one other. Well, China allows it, but it's hard to know anything about what's going on inside of China.
Right.
They only allow imports of albumin, so they don't
Mm-hmm.
allow imports of immunoglobulin. It's hard to get reliable data. Russia compensates for plasma donation. Again, similar to China, it's hard to know exactly what's going on in Russia.
So how do the European countries having this fixed rate? So how does what they do differ from what we do in the United States?
Right. So the European Union regulation is that it has to be voluntary, unpaid donations. And they consider a fixed rate set by the government as being like not determined by market forces. That's kind of important.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of not thinking of blood or plasma as a commodity. So they think that if they set like a fixed rate, it's like 35 euro or something like that, then that amount being immune from market forces means that it's not commodificatory. It also doesn't count as a form of payment. Instead, it's conceived of as compensation for time, effort, inconvenience, and so on. There's also differences with respect to the frequency of donation that's allowed. So I'm working from the top of my head. I know the Czech Republic allows 33 times per year. So something like twice a month or 3 times a month, something like that, up to 33 times per year. Germany, I think, is 50 times per year. Austria is 65 times per year. You'd have to double check these numbers. Like I said,
Yeah.
I'm working from memory. And the United States and Canada and Egypt, they allow up to 104 donations per year. So significantly more donations per year. However, in the United States, less than 1% of donors donate the maximum of 104 times per year. So that's an important
Mm-hmm.
consideration. Um,
Interesting
yeah,
note on that is when you survey donors, many of them feel they are donating the maximum amount. And it could be an education thing. It could also be the wording of the question was wrong, meaning they're donating the most they could possibly donate based on their time. So
yeah, or they might be thinking about the milliliters. So if you donate
yeah.
880 milliliters, that's considered a full donation or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. If you
Yeah.
donate around that number, then you might be confused about that too. It's also
Mm-hmm.
perfectly possible that people are confused about the difference. You said at the very beginning, transfusion medicine versus the manufacture of therapies. People
Mm-hmm.
might be confused about the differences between blood and plasma. I come across that all the time. They say, well, you're only allowed to donate once every 56 days. I'm like, yeah, that's true of blood, like whole blood,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not true of plasma, right? It's not true of source plasma, rather,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can donate that much more often. So those are possibilities.
So the US has a really solid framework, and again, the world relies on US plasma. But are there lessons that can be learned from some of these other countries for the US to adopt in its system?
Um, I think it's possible. So the Austrian system, I mean, look, the United States generates the most therapies. So the
Mm-hmm.
United States is responsible for saving more lives than any other country, even on a per capita basis. I think that speaks highly, like that should go in the like really good column of the
Mm-hmm.
United States. But as you note, there are concerns being raised, and people talk about them about the effects of very frequent long-term plasma donations. On the
Mm-hmm.
other side, I mean, we haven't studied the potential benefits of plasma donation even frequently. I know that a study recently came out about PFAS. These are these
Oh
uh,
yeah.
permanent permanent chemical, not chemicals, permanent like plastics or something in your
Mm-hmm.
bloodstream that are
Mm-hmm.
there, and there's nothing we can do about them except you can donate plasma, and that like helps reduce that. I do know from anecdotal reports, I've met so many donors, and many people say, look, I've changed what I eat. And so have become healthier. I get my physicals or I get some kind of medical something, right? When I go to
Yeah.
to the plasma center. But yeah, the concern about donating too frequently, I mean, it's possible that, you know, the Austrian limit of like 65 donations per year, you know, that's something that might count in favor of the Austrian system. The frequency of the checks on protein in Germany and in Austria, it's more frequent than in the United States. I think you're required to do it once every 2 months. Do I have that right?
We do it once every 4 months. We do a really in-depth check of the total protein once every 4 months, but we also check the total protein at every single donation.
Right. So they do an in-depth check in Germany much more frequently.
Mhm.
Now, I'd like to get access to that data because it might turn out that that's too frequent and it's not necessary. And of course, that introduces costs, and that's another like relevant consideration. The final therapy, the cost of the final therapy, and when we're talking about immunoglobulin, it's tens of thousands of dollars. Part of the function of that cost are all of the costs of getting that raw material and of converting it into immunoglobulin. So we want to be sensitive to the costs of like increasing regulations or something like that, because what
Sure.
you'll end up with is a more expensive therapy.
Mhm.
But at any rate, these are solutions if it turns out, but we haven't seen much in the way of evidence that this is harming donors. And the United States has now had, you know, decades of experience
Yeah.
with this. People report, look, I have a tendency to pass out, so I give plasma, but like I have hypotensive events. So I'm, what do you call them, floppers? I'm like a flopper on the floor. There's new machines coming out that are gonna shorten the amount of time it takes. The last time that I donated, I think it was 810 milliliters, but at the like 40-minute mark, I had to raise my hand. I had ice all over me or whatever. But I think if it was a shorter procedure, I'd overcome it more easily, and so be able to donate much more often than I do. So the new machines are coming that might improve things, but at any rate, like decades of experience, and you know, we haven't seen much.
There was some interesting data presented at the PPTA conference in Washington, D.C. last year about the effects on the immune system from frequent plasma donation. And it was pretty compelling because and I don't know if it had been peer reviewed. I think it was still in its infancy, but the initial data was very interesting because there was essentially no impact, it seemed like, in terms of reported, and it's all self-reported, right? But impact from frequent plasma donation regarding increase in infections or anything like that. So it was interesting data.
And all of the studies that have been done, even if you see a reduction in like antibodies or immunoglobulin, it's still within the range that medical experts say is perfectly appropriate and perfectly fine.
Okay. So I want to ask for your view on the future of plasma donations. What will be the ethical considerations as the field evolves?
Well, I think the most important prediction that I might make going forward into the future is not about the like different ethical considerations that might arise, but the number of countries that will allow donor compensation going forward into the future. I think we're going to see more countries allow it. I think we're going to see maybe creative sort of solutions like the partnerships that Grifols is creating with governments. I mentioned Egypt. That's like the Egyptian government owns 51%, Grifols owns 49%. So the government has a controlling share. That plasma has to, like, it's the Egyptian government that decides what happens to that plasma, where it goes, and so on. Canadian Blood Services has created a partnership. I know earlier I talked about Canadian Blood Services. I want to give them a lot of credit for this move. I've been talking to Canadian Blood Services for years now about this. I know patient organizations in Canada have, you know, they fought for donor compensation for a very long time. When provinces were thinking about banning donor compensation, it was the patient organizations that stood up and said, no, please don't. Right? Like this
Which
is
is very telling, by the way.
I think it is very telling. But Canadian Blood Services created a partnership with Grifols that is going to get going this year. Grifols remains an independent entity from Canadian Blood Services. However, Canadian Blood Services in those provinces like Ontario and British Columbia where there's a law saying that you're not allowed to compensate donors, Grifols is going to act as an agent on behalf of Canadian Blood Services, which is like a carve out, an exception within the law in Ontario and British Columbia. And that means Canadian Blood Services will have veto power over locations. So Grifols has to present, like, we want to open here in Toronto. And then CBS can say, well, that's too close to our blood collection center. So you can't open it here, but here's a different location where it's okay. And then all of the plasma collected by Grifols is exclusively used by Canadian Blood Services. So this, and I find this a little bit ironic, but like, one of the concerns that people have is that, like, oh no, we'll collect plasma and it'll be exported. And it's like, yes, but this is what we're relying on in the United States, right? Like, thank goodness the United States doesn't have export controls on therapies made from plasma. That's how Canada gets over 80% of our therapies, right? But at any rate, one objection is that this is plasma for export. Canadians won't benefit from it. And so, you know, Grifols can't collect plasma and then sell it to the quote unquote highest bidder on the international market, which, by the way, that argument is nonsense too. People, you know, CSL is an Australian company, and they sell therapies to Australia at like a better rate than what they sell elsewhere. So they could make more money, but they instead have agreements with Australia, which is their home country. Grifols is a Spanish company. They could make more money by selling outside of Spain, but no, they give Spain preferential treatment. Same with Takeda, a Japanese company, right? At any rate, so the worry about selling to the highest bidder, this is, yes, that happens sometimes, but that's not really how the industry operates. Plus, we have long-term contracts, right? So it's different.
Right. Yeah, the sort of these creative kind of evolutions are very interesting. There's this huge push for self-sufficiency in Europe. And Europe still, to me, seems fairly fractured in the way the regulation works. You have the European Union, but then the individual countries can make up their own rules and regulations. But then again, you have sort of a population factor as well, too, right? I mean, if Croatia now decides to start paying donors, the population's really low, right? So it's not going to contribute at the same rate some of these other, you know, larger countries are.
Yeah, although the Czech Republic does really well. The Czech Republic does not have a high population. I mean, there are countries like Poland, for example. Poland has about 40 million people. If Poland were to switch and allow donor compensation, that would make a very large difference. Italy gives you a paid day off work, which is so expensive if you think about it. Why don't they switch to donor compensation?
That's
if
more
France were to switch, at any rate, I mean, Poland just recently also introduced a paid day off work, and you're allowed to get, so my understanding is that now there are lineups on Friday. Like to donate blood or plasma. And we don't have in Poland,
they don't other set of issues.
Yeah, in Poland, they don't really have source plasma collection centers. They collect whole blood and use recovered plasma rather than source plasma. So there are lineups at these places on Fridays, maybe Mondays. And we can't use all of that. But of course, like, why Friday? Well, people are creating long weekends. And at any rate, that's super expensive for the companies that have to pay for that. It would be better, more efficient, and would space out donations better if you allowed donor compensation in Poland.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we would be remiss if we didn't allow you to respond to some of these statements, and these are some of your statements, by the way. So one of your statements is, if you may do it for free, you may do it for money. Just want to get a quick response from you on that.
I wrote a book in 2015 called Markets Without Limits, Moral Virtues and Commercial Interests. And in that book, myself and my colleague, my co-author, Jason Brennan, who's a philosopher who also works at the business school at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown, we defend the view that if you may do it for free, you may do it for money. The view that we defend is basically that, like, markets and money don't introduce moral wrongness where none was present before. So all of the objections that you might have to the use of money in certain contexts are actually not about the use of money, but about something else, like maybe the motives of the people involved, but like it's never necessary that you have certain motives when money's involved. Like you and I, people purchase pets and they love them like members of their own family. The fact that like money changes hands doesn't mean that the people involved think of dogs or cats as mere commodities or something like that, right? I've mentioned this before, but like nurses get paid doesn't mean that they have selfish motivations, right? Doesn't follow. You can have altruistic motivations. So then your objection, I mean, here's an objection, like, what about slavery? You can't pay for people. And of course that's true, but like it would be wrong for you to give a gift. Like the wrong of slavery is that you remove the autonomy of a person who is entitled to personal autonomy. It's not that money changes hands. Like if some king gave a gift of slaves to some queen, no money changed hands, but that wouldn't make that exchange better. So you need to ask, like, if you may do it for free, you may do it for money. Your objection might be to the thing itself rather than to the use of money associated with it. So that's the slogan that we defend in the book.
I like that. Okay, should we be able to sell a spare kidney or a slice of our liver?
Yeah, so here's another like theoretical case. And in the book, we address a number of different objections to the use of donor compensation when it comes to kidney or liver donation. Now, footnote, in the real world, this is a work of philosophy, but in the real world, the serious considerations here are that now we are talking about something that is a big deal. Unlike plasma donation, which is not a big deal, a nephrectomy or a kidney procedure is serious surgery. So then considerations like donor health are very significant. So then in the book, we're like, well, suppose that those are not real considerations, then what would be the problem with use of donor compensation? There's over 100,000 people on waiting list in the United States alone, waiting for a kidney. Most of those people are not going, like they're going to be on that waiting list in a futile way. Thousands of people die each year for want of a kidney. You and I have a spare kidney. We could donate a kidney if we were kind enough, but we're just obviously not kind enough to do it. Would introducing some form of compensation, some kind of financial incentive, would that increase the number of kidney donors that we have? I think so, yes. And then we should consider it. At least that's what we wrote in the book. Like I said, there are significant differences between plasma and kidneys, so I think people need to keep those things separate and recognize the separateness of those things. But again, my focus as an ethicist is always on like, how do we save and improve more lives? That's the primary focus. And if you keep that primary focus in mind, then maybe you'll be less concerned about worries like commodification, for example, which seems like a highfalutin, like a philosopher's concern about the human body or something like that.
I saw something related to this, and I can't remember if it had to do with your book, and that's how I came across it, but I can't even remember the timing of it, but it was an opinion piece that talked about a $10,000 tax credit for this very thing.
Yes. So, I mean, people are trying to be as creative as possible. I mean, notice, by the way, we do allow one kind of what you might call a market exchange, but like an exchange of valuables for consideration. We allow paired kidney donation. We allow that in the US, we allow it in Canada, and so on. Alvin Roth, who I mentioned, my friend who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, he kind of created this system. And the way it works is like, suppose that you need a kidney, Chris, and suppose I'm willing to donate a kidney to you, but you and I are not a match for each other. Then we would enter a paired donation list, and we try to find another couple that's in a similar situation as us, except the willing donor is a match for you, and I am a match for the person who needs a kidney in this other couple. And then what we do is we swap kidneys across this pair. And we can multiply the number of pairs. There's like complicated math involved here, but we can create chains of paired donations. Exchanging a kidney for a kidney is barter. That's a form of market exchange, but for one reason or another, people are like, yeah, but that's different from giving people money. So we do allow this kind of exchange. In fact, the United States had to amend the National Organ Transplant Act to allow paired kidney donation or paired kidney exchange, because they were like, oh, this might run afoul of the rule that you can't like get valuable consideration in exchange for an organ.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, final one. May spouses pay each other to watch the kids, do the dishes, or have sex. And every time I say, "Oh, hey, I got to babysit tonight," my wife corrects me and says it's not babysitting because they're your kids.
Okay. All right.
So,
Am I allowed to curse on this podcast? Is that
absolutely,
like,
absolutely.
okay,
Yes.
good.
Yeah.
So people often say, I say people, I mean, economists that I'm familiar with often say that like payment is a tax on bullshit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So look, when you're with your spouse and you have to do the dishes or something like that, and you go like, will you do the dishes? And your spouse says, oh no, that's a real pain. And then you go, well, yeah, it's a real pain for me too. How much of a pain is it for you as
Mm-hmm.
compared to me? We should try to minimize the total pain of us as a couple, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you don't involve money, then you can just sort of like lie. You can be like, well, it's the worst thing ever. I hate doing the dishes or whatever. But if you put a price on it, you go like, well, I hate it $20 worth. And then if I say, well, I hate it $25 worth, then it's like, okay, I can pay you $25 then to like do the
Mm-hmm.
dishes. Now, look, this is kind of a joke, and like most relationships aren't gonna work like that, but they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if an economist who conceive of money in ways different than you and I might, there are couples who are economists who frequently do this. Like, I'll pay you to do this. Here's how much I would pay, or here's how much I'm willing to pay. And then the other
Mm-hmm.
person says, well, actually, I'm willing to pay more. And then the person goes, oh, okay, then I should do it
Then I'll
because
do
you're
it. Yeah.
willing to pay more. Um, of course, it depends on the relationship, and money is symbolically associated with a lot of other things like motives, or like you're offering me money. What, you don't think that I'm kind enough to do it without money? So it might not work in a lot of different relationships, but it might actually be a cure, a solution to at
Mm-hmm.
least some cases where people fight about these things, or they hold on to resentments, like deep dark
Mm-hmm.
resentments, like I'm always doing the
Mm-hmm.
dishes,
Yeah.
right? And I don't wanna.
Yeah.
I hate it.
Right.
I'm always doing the laundry. I hate doing the laundry, but I feel this like pressure, or I feel this like guilt, like I gotta, or something like that. This is my contribution to the
Mm-hmm.
relationship. But if you just go like, well, here's my willingness to pay, then I mean, it might increase honesty. And shouldn't we be trying to increase honesty in our
Yeah.
relationships, Chris?
Yeah. And that's a great way to wrap it up, is shouldn't we be trying to increase honesty in our relationships? Peter, thank you for today. I really appreciate you walking through the ethical considerations of compensating donors for plasma donation. And, this has been a great conversation. I have been in the business for 20 plus years now. Oh, yeah, it's more than 20 years now. And I have been a plasma donor. I have interacted with thousands of plasma donors. And these are great individuals. And I strongly feel they should be able to participate in the upside here. And in the end, it's really about having a supply that is sufficient to treat the patients that suffer from these rare and chronic conditions. So,
Yeah,
any
I
final
agree.
points to add?
Yeah. Here's my final thought. We should put patients first. We should prioritize the point of collecting plasma in the first place. And secondly, we should be much more thankful and grateful to the donors who give plasma. I know some people who never donate plasma are like, yeah, but they're just doing it for the money. You don't know that. And nevertheless, it generates this like really good thing. And plenty of plasma donors that I speak to, in fact, I ran a survey of like 28,000 people, a subset of whom donated plasma in exchange for compensation. And more than 85% of those donors say that, helping others is one of their primary reasons for donating plasma. And I think if we stop thinking that like people are only doing it for the money or something like that, then I think we would see many more people participate in donating plasma. And I think it's important for people to donate plasma. So I want to encourage your listeners to do that more often. Whether you do it for compensation or not, it doesn't matter. It results in a therapy that saves lives. Let's make sure that patients have the therapies that they need in order to live lives that are good, fruitful, and like amazing.
Sure. Well, thanks again, Peter, for coming on. Really appreciate it, and I can't wait until the next time we get to catch up here. So,
Thanks for having me on. Love
All right.
speaking with you, Chris. Take care.
all right. Thanks, Peter. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening, and remember, plasma saves lives. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with your friends and fellow plasma donors. I'd love to connect with you. If you are interested in discussing today's episode further, please send a message to info@proesisbio.com. That's info@proesisbio.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media for up-to-date information. Find us by searching @ProesisBio. Talk soon.